Ready? All right, what's the first section of the Bible?
Pentateuch.
Very good. What's the first book of the Pentateuch? Next?
Exodus.
Next? Nope.
Numbers.
Nope. There's one more. One more before those two. Leviticus. There you go. What's next? Yep. What's next? Go ahead, Ronnie. There you go. You knew it was in there somewhere. All right. So that's the first section of the Bible. That's the Pentateuch. All right. What's the next section of the Bible? All right. History. All right. What's the first book of the history section? Now come on now, you're using the cheat sheet there. You're supposed to put your cheat sheet away. What's next? Next? What's next? Yep, 1st and 2nd Samuel. What's next? Yep. All right, next? Yep, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. What's next? Starts with an E. Ezra. What's next? Yep. And what's today? Esther. All right. Now this will be the last book in what we call the history section of the English Bible. And just a little bit about the book of Esther this morning. The book of Esther, the time frame comes in between Ezra and Nehemiah. So whenever you're thinking about this, you got to think about, okay, well, the king that's talking about here was a different king versus what we saw in Nehemiah and what we saw in Ezra. So just keep that in mind. And also one of the things I think we ought to think about is when we're thinking about Esther and we go through the book and we see how it ends, I think maybe it gives us a glimpse of how Nehemiah got a place in the king's chamber as a cupbearer, how he had found favor to get a place like that. So as we go through this, I hope that you'll see that. The writer of Esther is not known. We have no idea who it is. The book doesn't, nowhere in the book does it suggest who it is. It's all speculation at this point. Obviously, again, it was probably somebody who had either first-hand knowledge or was able to had access to records so that they could write it down. But we know that was somebody close to that. And also, the book of Esther is one of 2 books in the Bible that does not mention the word God. And so, even though we will not see the mention of the word God, one of the things that really shines through the book of Esther is, have you ever heard of the word providence? All right, well, this is a book about God's providence. And providences are those things that unfold that only God could do. Things that He works out over in His time for His people. And as we go through this, you'll really see that shine through, and you'll know that, hey, only God could have done that. So that's providence. Now you see providence all through the Bible, but in Esther you really see it shine through. And so whenever you think of the word providence, I always think of the book of Esther because it's so prevalent. Now, if you remember, just to give you an idea, because again, we need to look at where, how the people got where they are and what goes on. But when we look in the first chapter of Esther, I want us to remember what's going on. So let's look at this, Esther chapter 1. And so when we look at verses 1 through 4, the stage is set and we're kind of introduced to what's going on. It says, now in the day of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the princes were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. All right, so that sets the stage for where we are and all the events that are about to unfold. Now, the thing that it says here, that it says Ahasuerus, that's Xerxes. I think maybe the NIV version actually says Xerxes. Somebody got an NIV? Are you reading out of that? Yeah. But I believe it's the NIV that says Xerxes. And so Xerxes is the king. And it tells us where he reigned from. And one of the things as we go through this, there's a couple instances in here where it talks about the 127 different provinces of the Persian Empire. And as you'll see here, this was when Assyria held power. Now remember, this is important because we have to understand, okay, well, how did the Jews get over there? How did the Jews get all over the place? Well, number one, the Assyrians came in. The Assyrians came in and they deposited a lot of people up across the northern part of this. You can say up here, all through here, a lot of Jews were transplanted when Assyria came in and took over. And then next was the Babylonian Empire. Now the Babylonian Empire, they ended up taking people captive and taking them and setting them down here and relocating them in their different provinces. So the Jews had been scattered all across the Assyrian and then the Babylonian Empire. And then came the Persian Empire, which was much bigger than these. And so you have a much larger area. You can see where the Persian Empire went. Remember, it talked about from all the way from India. India is all the way over here. All of this, all the way down to Ethiopia, which is off the map. So the Persian Empire really had a massive empire, and it talks about being in Susa. That was the Persian capital. It was right here. And so this is where the events unfold, is in Susa, the citadel. But it talks about sending out letters throughout the 127 provinces of the Persian Empire. And so this covers wherever this empire covers. They had different provinces. They had governors. Because remember, Nehemiah had been made a governor of one of the provinces down here in Judah. So they had all these different types of governors and officials who helped run all of these different provinces for the Persian kingdom. And so that kind of sets the stage and tells you how Jews ended up all the way over here, hundreds and hundreds of miles away. Now it says that the king, he's throwing a big, big, big party. And they're partying for half a year. You know, that's a lot of partying. But in the midst of that partying, we're introduced to a queen. Now the thing about this party is the king didn't just throw this party for his royal guests. He threw the party for the great and the small. He threw it for everybody. So this was this was good for all the people. Now, in verse 9, it says, Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. Now, the queen had her own party. Now, a lot of people say, well, the men and the women were separated at that time, and that they didn't commingle like that. That was not true. There was no Persian customs that required men and women to celebrate differently or separately. According to Persian records, men and women, most of the time, the royalty, their wives were always present at the feast. So some would say that as we read on here, that this was kind of a foreshadowing of kind of what the relationship was with Vashti and Ahasuerus or Xerxes. Because it appears, when we look at this, in verses 11 through 12, the king says, hey, go get Queen Vashti and bring her out here because I want to show her off. She was like, no, I'm not having it. So what do you think happened? He didn't like it. So he got mad. Now there was a dilemma that arose out of this. And so in verses 13 through 18, it says, the king said to his wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment. And it says that the men next to him, all these people, it says in verse 15, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. Then Memucan said, in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the king's or the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. So they viewed this as a revolt. So, okay, well, what do we do about this? If we let this stand, this looks like a revolt. And so they had to come up with an idea, and so they did. They drew up a solution, and the solution was to get rid of Vashti and have a beauty contest to replace the queen. And so that was to instill some respect, or whatever you want to call it, fear, back into the women of the kingdom. I think one of the things that, over time we've seen is that in a lot of these lands and countries, and the way that their customs and procedures are in their culture, a lot of times women are treated like second-hand people. Sometimes they're treated as objects. Obviously, King Xerxes here, some of the women here, if you look at it, probably were treated somewhat like things or objects. But there is something to say about the role that God has for each of us. And there's a certain definition that we should have. In God's Word, God didn't make the woman the head of the household. He made the man the head of the household. And, God's intent was never for that to be an abusive role. It was always to be a respectful and loving role. And when you have that, you'll receive that in return. And so you'll have a submissive partner. And so, you know, it was never meant to be one in front of the other, but being side by side, which was why God took a rib, is to be part of the side. And so we see kind of like what they were rolling around here. So, well, if this happens, then, you know, all the women are going to revolt. I think we saw a little bit of this happen with the after the wars, when a lot of the women, when, you know, husbands were gone and weren't coming back, and they needed to be in the, you know, the factories needed people to work in the factories, so women started working in the factories, and you kind of had this feminist revolution. Well, then that kind of morphed into something more insidious, where, so you know what, we don't need this hierarchy, we don't need this patriarchy. And, you know, right now I think you see, you know, a lot of problems in churches is men and women who don't really understand their defined role in marriage. And we see that a lot. And, you know, I think it's a shame that, you know, if we follow God's ways, man, stuff works out so great, because you can have two partners who really, really love each other and still stay within the defined roles that God has for a man and a woman. And neither one of them run over each other.
That's the key thing right there, a man and a woman.
And neither one of them run over each other. You know, there's a mutual respect that God says you should have. But, you know, they didn't, in Germany and some other places, they wouldn't let people read the book of Esther. Especially, there was a time like when the Nazis were running through Europe, if they found a Jew with a copy of the book of Esther, they would shoot them on sight. Because they thought, well, you know, the women might revolt and cause problems. So, you know, the book of Esther has lasted the test of time, and people have not liked it. Like a lot of other books of the Bible, they don't like what happens in it. But anyway, kind of got off topic there a little bit, so let's get back in that. But there's this dilemma about what to do with her, so they plan on replacing her. And so this solution is drawn up to have women brought in and to compete for the title of Mrs. Xerxes. And so in chapter 2, we meet Esther. Now, in chapters 1 and 2 here, this is the way that you read through Esther. Esther's really, it's almost written like a normal letter is today. It's written with an introduction, the body of the letter, which, you know, contains all the contents of the letter, and then you have a conclusion. So it's really made up in kind of 3 different parts. So chapters 1 and 2 is really an introduction into everything, and then as we get into this, chapters 3 through 9 are really the meat and body of the letter. But in chapter 2, we meet Esther, and we learn how she gets to be in this group. It says that she was very beautiful. She had a nice figure, and so they picked her up as they were going through the kingdom there, picking up virgins to bring them who they thought would be suitable to be their next queen. They brought them back and started the processes for this. And also we're made aware of, we meet one of the other main characters in this, and that is Mordecai. So Mordecai, verses 5 through 6, tells us who he is and how he got there. So now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish. And I call it a Benjaminite. Benjamin, I always say Benjamin. Up there in Greensboro on Benjamin Road. But he's a Benjaminite who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. So it's telling us that Mordecai here is 4th generation. Because go all the way back to King Nebuchadnezzar. And when King Nebuchadnezzar had taken the king Jeconiah back to Babylon, there were other family members who came out of that. And Mordecai he's 4th generation here. So that tells you that some time had elapsed, and that all the way over in Persia that the Jews had begun to have families while they were there in captivity. So that tells us who he is and how he got there and who he's related to. And then in verse 7 we're introduced to Esther. Find out who she is. It says, he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her in as his own daughter. So Mordecai was Esther's cousin and was raising her as his own daughter. So obviously there was a little bit of age difference there. So obviously Esther's mother and father must have died early at a young age. And so she was left, and it was not unusual for adoption to take place like this within the immediate family. So Mordecai took her in, and she was taken as one of the beautiful young women. Said that she was very beautiful, had a nice figure, so she was easy on the eyes. And so they took her, and says that the young women, they were all gathered and taken to the king's harem. And as Esther was there, in verses 10 and 11, Mordecai gives her some, or checks on her. And it says that Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And so he charged her and said, look, don't tell them who you belong to, because that could mean trouble for you. Because I guess that there was still a heavy sentiment of anti-Semitism towards the Jews. So he said, just keep that to yourself for now. And verse 11 it says, and every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So he was keeping tabs on her just to see what was going on. And there are some who speculate that because Mordecai had access to the king's court and he was able to be there so often, some people say that he possibly had a role there with these people. And so obviously it wasn't uncommon for the Jews to have some special privilege. Obviously Zerubbabel and Ezra had left previous to this and had been given special exemption by the king, by a Persian king, to go back to Israel and rebuild the temple. And eventually after this, Nehemiah would go back down and build the walls. So it wouldn't have been uncommon for a Jew to have some kind of special privilege in that atmosphere. And so whether Mordecai was some sort of low-level official, we don't know, but that's a speculation that some people have. Now it tells us the procedure for being in the king's presence in verses 12 through 14. It just talks about the things that they had to go through, the purification process. They had to. It was quite a while. It was about a year-long process that they had to go through before they would ever see the king. And so, it just took some time, and we find out that when it was time for Esther to go in, we find out that she's a wise young woman. because she relied on the king's top eunuch, the one that was looking after all of them. She relied on his recommendation, because who would know the king better than his top person looking after them? And so she under his recommendation, she only goes before him with what he recommended, because he knew what he would like most. And so she had found favor in the eyes of the one who was looking after them. And then so that leads us to Esther making her appearance before the king. Now when she goes in and the king looks at her, he just falls in love with her. Now, also in this, it also tells us how long it had been since Vashti had been gotten rid of. So it had been several years since Vashti had been replaced as king. So this was a long process that had taken place, but also we know that in between when Vashti was taken care of and when the next queen was picked, which would be Esther, we know that Xerxes had went to war with the Greeks during this time. So that might be some reason why there wasn't a queen picked before then, is because he was off to war. But when he came back, he said, well, I guess the kingdom needs a queen, so we need to take care of that. So the search was on, and so he walked in, and he was beside himself when he saw Esther. And he immediately made her queen. He went and put the royal crown on her head. And it says that the king went out and gave a great feast for her. And it says, and here's a great thing, it says that there was a remission of taxes. It means he cut taxes. That'd be a welcome thing, wouldn't it?
Must have been a Republican.
Must have been. But it was a jovial, joyous time. And then we're given this little short paragraph, and it's talking about Mordecai. Now, and we bring Mordecai back into this because I think this little thing is important about what happens here. Mordecai, he falls. He's in the right place at the right time, and is it by coincidence? Is there any coincidence with God? No, there's not, because the event that we see unfold here helps Mordecai later on. And so Mordecai is there. He's there near the king's near the king's gate, and that's where a lot of official business takes place. You'll see that throughout the Old Testament. If you read, whenever the king goes out to have official business, they would have certain like chambers and stuff there at the main gate. And you see this with a lot of the Israelite cities, and you would have these different chambers. They would go in and they would have all the different like business meetings and such. And so here he is. He's at the king's gate, and he overhears a plot of two people who want to take hold of the king, lay hands on him. Well, that means to dispel him, to kill him. Now, Mordecai could have said, hey, here's a pagan king. Why not? Let them go at it. Let them take care of it. Why does that concern me? I'm a Jew. Because I think this shows that Mordecai was a man of integrity. And he said, that's not right. Here's a devious plot to do harm to someone. And also he could have had in mind, hey, Esther's the queen now, so maybe it would be bad for her if the king was dispelled. So he goes and he tells of the plot, and he tells Queen Esther, and Esther brings it up before the king. And so they said they did an investigation, and then both men were hanged on the gallows. And so it was recorded. That's important. It was recorded in the Chronicles of the King. Now, there's documents that say that any time that a king went out, like during the war, whenever he was warring with other people, he would have scribes write down things that people would do that were like heroic, or someone that did something real valiant, or someone who was fighting hard, they would make notes of this so that it could be remembered later. And so they remembered Mordecai in this, and that's important because that comes up later. Now in chapter 3, this is where we really get into the meat of everything that happens in the book of Esther, because here we're introduced to the henchmen, and we're introduced, like everybody all comes together, and we see a plot played out, event after event after event. And so here in chapter 3, what I would call the battle between Haman and Mordecai starts. Now what happens is the king, we see Haman come in. Haman is one of the top officials, and the king, King Xerxes, he makes Haman here the top guy. He's over all the other officials, so he's second under the king. And so he has a lot of authority. And so one of the things that the king did says that whenever Haman is out, is that people need to bow to Haman, show him respect. Well, who do you think refuses to bow down? Mordecai. Now it says that he does this day after day. So it wasn't just a one-time thing. It was day after day that Mordecai would refuse to bow down. And it came to Haman's attention that he was a Jew. The men came to say, hey, Mordecai, he's a Jew. And that's why he doesn't bow down to you. And so it was at this point that Haman had these thoughts, and this is verses 1 through 6 there of chapter 3, is that he gets these ideas because of Mordecai, that he wants to annihilate all the Jews because of Mordecai. Now, obviously this is someone who has a lot of hatred for the Jewish people. Now, if you remember back in Ezra, there were governors and people who were stirring up trouble, even though the Jews had found favor with the king, with the Persian king. There were people who were causing trouble for the Jewish people. They hated the Jewish people. So here again we see this carrying on. There were other people like this throughout the kingdom, and then we see it again after this with Nehemiah. So having hatred against the Jews was nothing new. And so day after day this went on, and Haman just got, he would get more and more mad, and so finally he just had this idea in his head that he wanted to completely annihilate the Jews. And so he wanted to bring this up to the king. So we look at verse 7, and we have this interesting thing here. Verse 7, it says, in the first month, which is in the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots, before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month, till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Now, casting lots, that was part of, that was something that the Persians did as a custom. And what we see is, it says, there's important information there that tells us, it gives us a win. For both events, it gives us a win of when they're casting lots, and it gives us a win for when he wants to carry out this annihilation plot. And it happens in the first month. It says that they're casting lots in the first month. Now, this was part of their custom, and they would do this because they would cast lots in the first month to dictate major events that they would have throughout the year. And so that's why they said they kept casting lots, is so that they would have a calendar of events. And so this particular thing that he wanted to carry out ended up happening on the last month of the year. So a full year later is when this plot was to be carried out. And so that was something this was Persian custom. Now what we have here is that Haman has his plan. They cast lots. They have the event ready. He has a day in mind. And so he goes to the king and throws his plan out there to the king. He said, hey, king, how about this? So verses 8 through 11, he goes in there. He said, hey, there's a people that's scattered. He doesn't tell them that they're Jews. He said, there's a certain people that's scattered across your kingdom. So remember what I was showing you earlier, where the Assyrians, they had scattered Jews across the northern part. The Babylonians had come down and scattered them across that part. And obviously over in Persia, there in the capital, there were Jews there. So there were Jews all over the kingdom. So he said, there's a certain people who are scattered throughout your whole kingdom. And they're troubled. He said, their laws are different from all other people's. You know, the Jews were a little bit different because most of the other people, most of the other kingdoms and peoples, they worship many gods. But here you've got a group of people who worship one God, the only God, the God of Yahweh, the God Yahweh. All right, and so he said this is a different group of people, different than any other in the kingdom, for they have a different set of laws. And he says they don't keep the king's laws. Now, one thing that we do know throughout, reading the Bible, whenever they were in another, taken into captivity, if you remember, we'll bring it up when we get to Ezekiel, but Ezekiel, he specifically prophesies to them, and he says, do what they tell you to do. Live in their cities, and be happy. That was directly from God. He said, you're going to be there. Might as well make the most of it. And so the fact that he says that they don't follow the king's laws, well, as long as it didn't go against the law of God, then they were fine. Now, one thing, obviously, he was probably blowing it out of proportion because Mordecai wouldn't bow to him. Obviously, that was something that was a law in the book of God, the book of Moses, the book of the law, the Pentateuch. What's the first two commandments?
But that God with all our heart.
No. That's what Jesus says in the New Testament. In the Ten Commandments.
Have no other God before me.
Yeah, have no other gods before me. And so, the idea of bowing down to a person, that was something that was considered, you worshiping someone other than God. So obviously, that would have been a problem for Mordecai. And there would have been some other things, but for the most part, they could have lived there. They could have followed the king's commands as long as they go against God's word. So what we know that many of the Jews, they lived harmoniously in these pagan kingdoms. So Haman was probably blowing this out of proportion because, number one, he hated Mordecai, and obviously he hated the Jews. So he blew this probably out of proportion. So he pitches this to the king, said, here's all these problems, and I think it would be good for the king because these people they're going to unsettle the kingdom. At the end of verse 8 there, he said it's not in the king's profit to tolerate them. Now verse 10 here, it says that the king took his signet ring off and he gave it to Haman. Now that was it was just a ring, but it had huge consequences because any letter, any law, anything that had the signature or the signet, when they had that stamp of that ring, that was like having the king's signature. And so the king handed that to Haman and basically said, here, do what you want. And anytime somebody who's got that kind of hatred, insidiousness in their heart, and you give them that much power, what do you think they're going to do?
Go against you.
They're going to go against them. So the king gives him his ring, and then it tells us that the scribes write out the proclamation that all the Jews would be destroyed. That was the letter that they sent out. And again, it tells us that it went out through all the provinces, all 127 provinces in the kingdom, from all the way from India to Ethiopia. So the entire kingdom, that letter went out saying that all Jews would be destroyed on this day. There was a certain day that they had cast lots for. That was when it would occur. And so we skip over to chapter 4 here. After learning this, so in the first 3 verses we see that Mordecai, again, he comes out to the king's gate, and he's wearing ashes and sackcloth. And do you know what that means when they wear ashes and sackcloth?
They're in mourning?
They're in mourning. Yes, they're in deep despair. And so he comes out in ashes and sackcloth because he is very disturbed and saddened about this announcement that had went out that they would be destroyed on this certain day. Verses 4 through 11, Esther had heard about what was going on. So Esther had sent some clothes down to Mordecai to put on because evidently it was causing problems there. Mordecai said, "Get those out of here. I'm not wearing those." So he refuses what she had sent. Now she didn't know. She had not heard yet what Haman's plot was, what he was going to do. She had not heard it. So in verses 4 through 11, she inquires to her servants, because she hasn't talked to Mordecai in person, so they're going through servants. It says, "Tell me what's going on. I don't know what's happening here. Tell me the plan." So Mordecai, he explains to Esther the what of what's going to happen, the why it's going to happen, and the who. So he names out all factors for her. He lays it out expressly for her. He explains the plot, the culprit, and the money. Because Haman said, "I'll take my own money and put towards this effort. It don't even have to come out of the king's treasury. I'll use my own money to take care of it." So Mordecai gives her every detail of what's been laid out. Now Esther's response to Mordecai is that even though I'm the queen, if I go before the king without being asked to come into his presence, that could be a problem. She could have been killed for coming into the king's presence without him accepting her coming to that. And that was part of custom. That was part of their custom in those days. And so she goes in and stands in the king's chamber. Verses 12 through 14. And this is I think this is one of the pivotal moments of this book. And one of the things that I think is one of those things where we can have a lot of application today. Because we know that the forces of evil are against us. We know that the forces of Satan, he's trying to destroy us any which way he can. We know that. We understand that. And when we have the opportunity to stand up and do something about a potential problem, do we stand up and do it, or do we sit on the sidelines and just allow it happen? Well, in a lot of ways, the church has been taught, well, just sit back and just kind of let it play out. Don't make any waves. You don't need to upset anybody. Even all that sinful, don't say nothing about it. And so now we have a really weak church in the West. And what we have is, as we were talking about earlier, we have a progressive wing of the church, which I don't think it's not really a wing of the church. I think it's a wing of the false church. It's not the true church. The true church would never accept any of those things that progressives do. But this is really a fantastic, just a couple verses here that really have a lot of impact. So after Esther had said, look, if I go before the king, I could be killed. Basically, what do you want me to do? So in verse 12 here, in chapter 4, it says, and they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. I want to stop there for a second because he's saying, look, it doesn't matter if you say anything or not. We're God's people, and He will save us from annihilation whether you do anything about it or not. So I think that tells you a little bit about Mordecai, who's a pretty faithful man. He knows the history. It sounds like he knows the history of Israel, and it sounds like he knows God pretty well.
Yeah.
Because whenever the people were in, you think about all the times that God's people were in a pinch, and there was nowhere else to turn, who showed up? God did. And he used that term, deliverance. I think that's a big word there, deliverance. But he says, don't think you'll escape this, because if she chooses to do nothing, basically he's saying, look, it'll come back on you at some point. And it'll destroy you and your household. So he says, so don't think you'll escape this if you say nothing. But then after he tells her this, that God will deliver them anyway, even if she says nothing, he says, and who knows? And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? He's saying, what if God just happened to put you where you are, just so you could have an audience before the king to plead for your people? I think that's an application for us, because as the church, we've got a pretty big platform to stand on. What we're doing right now? We're videotaping this, and we can put it on social media. We can share it with people. We can talk about it. What about all the trouble we're seeing today, and the church stands by and does nothing? What if we were put in a position just for a time as this, and we could do something about it?
Look how many times God used me in His defense to go against tyranny.
Exactly.
Like Moses.
God
Egypt,
called people.
Set my people free.
Yeah, God called a lot of people.
So many times.
And and it was always in God's perfect timing.
Yeah. Yeah, he does.
Right now, the church is kind of at a bad point right now.
Well, he's still in control.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt about that. But I think we have this passive attitude. Well, we'll just pray about it and it'll just go away. That's not how it works. Faith without works is dead. Now, I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that prayer doesn't work. Yes, prayer works. I know that for a fact. I've seen it. Not just for myself, but for other people. So I know that prayer works. But what I'm saying is, when you have the opportunity to do something, and God puts you right there for that purpose to be able to do something, and you don't do it, and you say, well, I'll just pray about it. If you had a chance to give somebody $1 and say, you know what, I'm just going to pray for you. When you had $1 in your hand and said, I'm going to pray for you. Oh, you thought I was going to give that $1, didn't you? No, I'm going to pray for you. Hope things work out for you. See, God gave you something right there to do something.
I had something happen to me one time, several years ago. Every time I hear that, it brings it to mind. I'll make this short. I was up, we've been out in Arkansas, and I was coming back down 52, just south of Mount Airy, and I was driving an old truck I bought out of the junkyard for $125 and put a carburetor on it, a little Ford Cougar. But it turned out to be a pretty good little truck. But it was about wore out. Well, it overheated, cut off with me, so I circled in off the ramp and in behind the neighbor's food store, a convenience store. I thought, well, if it cools off, I get it cranked. Well, I run my battery down, being impatient. I didn't have to cool off. And this guy come through, he come around back. Of course, our windows. He said, you got problems? I said, yeah. I said, I run my battery down. I said, I got a set of cables. I said, if I get somebody hooked to me, it was one of these high dollar rear airs, it was antique. Boy, I'd sure like to help you. He said, I've just spent so much money on this thing. He said, I sure hope you good luck, though. He drove on off. He had good intentions. He was sincere. About just a few minutes later, here come a little hot rod Mustang around, some young people in it. A couple of guys, may have been more than two, I don't know, and it was probably worth as much more than that Riviera because it was a little older model.
Yeah.
That thing was boom, 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 boom. I mean,
Yeah.
it had a built engine in it. And he said, sir, you having trouble? I said, yeah, I got a problem. I said, run my battery down and I need to jump. They said, you ain't got no problem. He jumped out, popped his head up. 5 minutes later, I was going down the road.
Yeah.
Well, the first guy had good intentions, but these kids, they put some action into it.
Yeah.
And I think about that every time
I think about, what Esther was saying, or what Mordecai was saying here. He said, don't you think God put you where you are at this moment for a reason?
Yeah.
Didn't God give you this audience right now for a reason? And evidently, boy, that really struck a chord to her.
Yeah.
Because as we look at this, after he said that, she changes her tune, verses 15 and 17. It says, then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything that Esther had ordered him. So Esther said, all right, with fasting came prayer. So he was telling, go back and pray. She said, go back and pray. Get all of them you can. Let's hold a prayer meeting. Let's pray. Let's fast and pray. And that's what they did. They fasted and prayed. And she said, look, I'm going to go before the king, and if it costs me my life, it costs me my life, but I'm going to go. Now, we get into chapter 5. At the end of the fasting and prayer, it says that she had put on her royal robes, and she goes and she stands in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarter. It says, while the king was sitting on the royal throne inside the throne room, opposite the entrance of the palace. So when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So, he's saying, hey, I accept you. You can come before the king. And so she goes before the king. He finds favor. And he says, what can I do for you? What is your request? I'll give you anything, even up to half of the kingdom. So he's very generous, and obviously he had taken a liking to Queen Esther. And so she says, hey, I want you to get Haman, and we're going to have a feast. And so they went to this feast. He asked her once they got there, said, hey, what's your wish? What can I do for you? Even up to half the kingdom. And she says, well, she said, bring Haman back tomorrow, you and him, and we'll have another feast, and then I'll tell you what my wish is. Okay. Now that puts something in Haman, and I want you to see the irony of this. In verse 9 of chapter 5, it talks about Haman in his preparations with Mordecai, his plans for Mordecai. Haman goes back home and he's bragging. He has no idea what is about to hit himself. But he's boasting and said, hey, I had a feast with just me and the queen and the king. I must have really done something special. I must have really been a good boy. They must really think a lot about me. Now he's real prideful. He's puffing his chest out, telling his family how special he is. Before he got home, he saw Mordecai at the gate. It just made him madder. And when he got home, he was telling his family about this. And after he brags about and boasts about how great all this was, he said, hey, none of that matters just as long as I see Mordecai hanging. That's all I care about. I want to see him hanging. And so his family comes up with this idea, said, hey, won't you build this big old gallows and put him on it? Now, it tells us here, it said, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. And this idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows built. So that very day, he started on it right away, because he intended to put Mordecai on it the next day. And 50 cubits high, that's 75 feet. That's pretty big. Now, something that we picked up on in one of the other books, something that the Persians would do, it says here that he hung him on the gallows. And we think of hanging from the gallows. We think of a typical, the hangman, hanging on a rope with a noose and doing that. But in this culture, typically what that meant, because we learned this from, I think maybe in Ezra it said this, one of the people they had taken a pole from their own house and impaled him with it. And that's what they were talking about. So he had this, he was planning on impaling Mordecai and putting him up there. And that's what they would do. So he said, go do that. Now, here's the irony of this. He had all this planned out. It was suggested to him, man, I'm going to take care of Mordecai tomorrow, and after I see him hanging on the gallows, I'm going to go have this grand feast with the king and queen. Man, I am walking tall. Well, you know what comes before the fall? Pride. He's walking proud. So in chapter 6, now the king, in the first couple verses there, the king, he can't sleep. So he said, basically what he's saying is bring me something really boring so I can fall asleep. So bring the records. So they bring the records, and after they start reading the memorable deeds it said it was found written how Mordecai had foiled the plot to kill the king. And so the king says, well, wait a minute. Has this Mordecai, has he been given anything? Has he been celebrated for his good deeds and helping save my life? Well, no. Well, I need somebody to take care of this right away. He said, well, who's in the court? And it just so happened to be Haman. Now, why was Haman not at home? He was just home. Why did he come back? Because remember, he was going to tell the next morning. He was going to go the next morning and tell the king, hey, we got to get rid of this Mordecai. We're going to put him on the gallows, on the stake. Well, the king said, who's in the court right now that can carry out this celebrating of Mordecai? He said, hey, Haman's here. Bring him in here. He said, hey, Haman, what do you think I should do to celebrate the person who foiled a plan to save my life? And Haman's like, well, here's what I would do. You know, maybe he's thinking about himself here. Maybe he's thinking about, well, I've been invited to these 2 feasts. Maybe he's wanting to do something for me. So here's what I would do, King. I would court him around. I'd put on the king's robes and I personally escort him around the town so that everybody could see him. It says, if you want to read this, this is chapter 6, starting verse 7. It says, Haman said to the king, for the man who the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to the one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said, that sounds great. Now, hurry up and go do just as you said. Do everything you just said. Go and do it to Mordecai, because that's who I want to honor. Don't you think there's a lot of irony in that? There's a lot of irony. Don't you think that chapped old Haman real good? He's got his mind set on putting him on that stake, but now he's got to escort him around town. And then we get to verses 12 and 13, and it tells us that Haman, after he did this, he did what the king said, but it said that he hurried home and put his head in his hands because he was humiliated. Because I'm sure that people knew that he was the one who wanted to kill Mordecai. He was the one who wanted to annihilate the Jews. So they were like, huh. Well, they were probably saying, how ironic is this? Because why else would he be humiliated? So here he is humiliated. God is bringing this thing full circle back on Haman's head. Now, while all this is happening, they come and get him and say, hey, it's time for the feast. It's like, man, I can't catch a break. So he goes, he's humiliated, and he goes to the feast. So in chapter 7, so the king and Haman, they went to the queen's feast. And notice that they were having a good time before the queen dropped the ball on them. And so the king asked, What is your wish? What do you want, even up to half the kingdom? Tell me what it is. Verse 3 said, Then Queen Esther answered, If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. For our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, Who is he, and where is he, who dared to do this? And Esther said, A foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. So now it was coming full circle for Haman, for his plot against Mordecai at least. Now, here's what the king does. Verse 7, it says, And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. It said that Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? And as the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. So, Haman, that was his big fall from grace. And then the eunuchs that were attending there said, Hey, you know, old Haman here, he had some gallows built for old Mordecai. King said, Well, go hang him on that. And so the very stake that he wished to hang Mordecai on, he himself was hung on. Now all of that, I say this, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. That was the Lord exacting vengeance on behalf of his people. Now, when we look at chapter 8, now Esther and Mordecai had come before the king, and they were talking with him, and Haman still had the king's signet ring. So they took that ring off, and it was given to Mordecai. And so Mordecai had taken the place of Haman as being the second in charge under the king. And then and it talks about how Esther told the king, said, Hey, King, I still have a problem. And he said, Well, what is it? Tell me what's the problem? What can I do now? And she said, Well, this order had went out with your signature on it, basically, to all the provinces, that on this day, that all the Jews are to be killed. They're to be annihilated. I need you to reverse this order. But the king says, I can't reverse this order. He said, once it's been signed and sealed, it's delivered. Which, we understand that because when we read about Daniel, and we'll talk about this when we get the book of Daniel. Remember, the three people had plotted against Daniel. And remember, they had the king to write an edict because it was the custom of the Medes and Persians that whenever a law was written, they couldn't revoke it. And so they did that to entrap Daniel. Because remember, Daniel went and prayed. They knew he prayed 3 times a day, and that was specifically why that law was written, was to ensnare him. So, this custom was still intact, and he said, I can't go back on that. But they had the signet ring, and so here, you can do this. Do what you need to do. So they wrote another letter. They wrote another letter that went out in verses 1 through 8, talking about the Jews could defend themselves by any means necessary against those who would wish to destroy them. And so in verses 9 through 14, the scribes write it down, the orders, and they're sent out through the entire province. Now remember, the order that had been sent previously, it's still active. The king, even though the king is the king, he can't revoke it because that's the law of the land. He can't revoke it. So that law is still in effect. So basically this other law is kind of like a cancellation of the other one. Now what we find out is that there's still people who want to enact on the first one. They still want to carry out that first edict, and they're going to disregard this second one. So the Jews earned their right to defend themselves on that day. And after the letters are sent, I want you to look at verses 15 through 17 of chapter 8. It says, when Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday, and many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for the fear of the Jews had fallen on them. So there was a lot of people who saw what had taken place. They saw what had happened to the Jews. Whether they recognized that it was God who intervened for them or not, they said, hey, I want to be a Jew. I want to be a part of that. Because they had fear. Now, chapter 9, we get to where it talks about what happens. In verse 1 it says, now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. So those who would wish to do the Jews harm, it didn't work out for them. The very opposite occurred. And something else we'll notice here, in verses 2 through 4, it says that the officials in the provinces and the leaders, they helped the Jews. Now, these were the Persian officials who were helping the Jews defend themselves. You know, they very well could have carried out the first edict, but they saw what was happening, and they knew Mordecai was second in charge. I think they were pretty smart in this and said, hey, I think it'd be a good idea to follow this other edict, and we probably ought to help these guys. And so they did. And so as you read through verses 5 through 19, it tells of all the people who tried to come and hurt the Jews. They were dispatched all across all provinces, and there was a great number of people who hated them were killed. Now, because of this, because of what God had done for them, because God had rescued them, because God had delivered them, there was a required, hey, we're going to have a great feast. We're going to celebrate and we're going to have joy. And it was said that it needed to be recorded. And so when we look over in chapter 9 and we skip down to verse 20, it tells us about the establishment of the Feast of Purim. All right, now this was not a feast, because there were other feasts that were law-binding, or binding of the law, I should say, that had been expressly said, hey, you will celebrate this, like Passover and the Feast of Booths, things like that. Those were things that they were required to take part in. But this was a new feast. This was something that had not been ordained by the law, but it was a new feast. And it was to celebrate God's delivering them from this grasp of the evil that was trying to overtake them. And so what we have here is it tells us in chapter 9, verses 20 through 32, it gives us a summary of kind of how it all played out. It talks about how Haman had, or how Mordecai had foiled a plot to kill the king, and he found favor, and Haman wanted to kill him, and how God turned all that thing around, and how Esther and Mordecai, God had put all this stuff into place, and because of those things, because that deliverance of God, here's what we're going to do. We're going to celebrate. And he talks about how they came up with that, like the date that they would celebrate it is the date that the lot fell on them to all be annihilated. So that's why they call it Purim, is because that word pure was a Persian word that means lots. Because remember, Haman said they kept casting lots day after day. And so that the day that they were to be destroyed, they had cast lots for that day. So that's why they call it pure. And then the im is just just something attached on the end of it. But that's why they call it the Feast of Purim, is because it's the Feast of Lots. And they were delivered on that day. And so that's when we're going to have, that's when we're going to celebrate this day. Is on this particular day, this particular month, and we're going to have feast, and we're going to give gifts, and we're going to take care of the poor, and we're going to do all these good things because God has done good for us. And he said, we're not just going to do it, just whenever. He said, we're going to continue doing this for all time. We're going to remember this. And so there at the end of chapter 9, it says that the queen, it says that the Jews accept what Mordecai has said and has recorded. And even today, this feast is still celebrated by the Jews. The Feast of Purim. So 2,400 years later, is still being celebrated. That God had delivered them from this desperate time. And then this is really the conclusion here. There's only 3 verses there in chapter 10. So the king went back. I guess he had laid off the taxes long enough and said, well, I better put some taxes back on the land if I want to keep things up. So he sent them. He started taxing them again, and talks about all the things. Basically, it talks about Mordecai here. And it talks about how he was second in command. It said that he was great among the Jews. It said that he was popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. So this was someone that God had put into place to do good things in a pagan kingdom. We've seen that with we've seen it with Daniel, because Daniel would have the setting of Daniel would have taken place before this. We also see it with Zerubbabel. We see it with Ezra. And then here we have Mordecai, who was second in command under the king. And then when his son Artaxerxes is on the throne, that's when we see Nehemiah as the cupbearer in the kingdom. So obviously Mordecai had influence going forward, where Jews were in the king's palace, taking care of the king's needs. So God put people where He wanted them. God made a way for people to be there and to do good things for Him. I don't think we're any different today. I think God puts us where we need to be. God puts us where He wants us. And the things that we do with our life, that's our choice. But He paves the way for us. He gives us the door to walk through. And it's our decision whether we walk through them or not. You know, we have the opportunity to do great things for Christ, no matter how insignificant or how great we might think we are. Even the smallest thing could be great in the kingdom. And so, you know, we always need to be thinking about, you know, here's an opportunity that God laid at my feet. What am I going to do with it? Am I going to trust Him with this opportunity? Or am I going to be selfish with it? I think it's a question we need to ask. I think it's a question that we get presented with almost daily.
Yeah.
Sometimes multiple times in a day. And me, I'm sure like everybody else, we've all failed at it. You know, we've all had opportunities where, you know, where
To witness to people.
where God could have said, you know, I put you there for just a time as this. And you didn't obey me. You know, and we're going to have to answer for that. You know, we're going to get rebuked by Him for that.
Well, you get it under the blood, you can, that forgiveness.
So, you know, we're going to have to have an account one day.
Oh, yeah.
You know, whether we're covered by His blood or not, we still won't have to give an account.
You're going to bend that knee.
So, you know, but I found that, you know, when we have these opportunities, sometimes they're difficult opportunities. You know, sometimes they're easy. You know, we might think they're hard, but they're really not that hard if we just trust God. But I really like the book of Esther. I think there's a lot there that, you know, it's an exciting story to read through, or exciting events to read through. I think there's a lot of application there for us as Christians, you know, about being bold in times of difficulty, you know, speaking up when other times, you know, where we might want to be silent, being reminded that God is with us, being reminded that God has paved the way for us, being reminded that God has thought about these things beforehand. God knows what's going to happen before we do. You know, I mean, those are all things that we can apply out of Esther into our everyday Christian lives. And so I hope that as even as we read Esther and we talk about deliverance, you know, we've got Easter coming up this weekend. What about the deliverance there? You know, here's the Messiah walking into earth, and, you know, people were thinking, well, you know, He was crucified. There goes our deliverance. Jesus said, no, I ain't going nowhere. The devil just made you think I went somewhere, but I didn't. Jesus delivered us from death. That's a good message for us today, thinking about Easter. The greatest deliverance of all was that from death, when Jesus came out of the empty tomb victorious.
I watched the program the other night, and it explained every aspect of crucifixion. I believe Rick Brennan had it on.
Yeah.
It was, even though you've heard it thousands of times, when they really get into detail,
Well, you know,
cruel.
the Easter, I don't want to call it the Easter story. I want to call it the Easter event. The Easter event, it never gets old. It becomes, it's almost like it becomes new every time, and it becomes more exciting. I think as we grow older and we grow more mature in our Christianity, it should excite us more, knowing of what He did for us, knowing that He saved us from certain death. And I constantly, I remember D.L. Moody in something he said. And it's something I hope I never forget, and I like to share it as much as possible. But he was talking about salvation, and he said, those that are born twice will only die once. He said, but those that are only born once, they will die twice. And that has always stuck with me of how true a statement that is. And so, just the deliverance, we don't have to be in bondage to sin. Jesus delivered us from that. He delivered us from death. He has delivered us from an eternity and separation from Him. So, it ought to excite us more and more every single day, thinking about the crucifixion and the resurrection. And just throw this in there. They were supposed to come out with it this year, but because of COVID, it got pushed back. But they are making a sequel to The Passion of the Christ. Like I said, it was supposed to come out this month, but it got pushed back. So it'll be coming out March of next year. But it's already in production. They're already filming. And it's got Jim Caviezel. He will play Jesus again. And as far as I know, they've got all the same characters who are coming back to play that. But it'll be talking about the plot of it. Will be talking, from what I understand, because it's really kind of hush-hush. There's really not a lot out on it. But I do know that it's going to be talking about the time in between Jesus was put on the cross and the time that He come out of the empty tomb. And I don't know how much time they're going to go after He comes out of the empty tomb. I imagine they'll probably elaborate on some of what happens after He comes out of the tomb and before He ascends to heaven. But they're going to focus primarily on that time that he was from the time He died until the time He come out. So I'm really looking forward, really excited about when that comes out. That's a great movie. The Passion of the Christ is a great movie, and it just reminds us of what He went through for us. And I hope that this movie that they're coming out with, I hope it'll really impact this hurting world and really bring some people to Christ. Any other comments or anything about the Book of Esther here?
Yeah, this Haman, he's the same line of when it comes down to like Hitler.
Yeah, he's very. He has some of the same characteristics for sure.
But this area his kingdom was Germany, wasn't it?
No,
It wasn't.
No, that's
Eventually Germany.
no, it's this down here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's down here. It's on the other side of Iraq. So you're looking. The Persian Empire was predominantly Afghanistan, Pakistan. This area in here. That was.
But wasn't it two lines that come off? Was it Cain and Abel that went out and spread across the world at that time?
No, they didn't. It wasn't until Genesis 11 at the Tower of Babel that they finally dispersed.
Okay.
Because remember, God had told them that, it was from Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That was the rebuilding of society. And then, after they come off the ark and society was being rebuilt, then you get to the Tower of Babel. And then from that time, Tower of Babel, that's when God hits them with different languages so that they'll disperse.
They was all talking the same language.
Yeah, because he had already told them, he said, look, I want y'all to go and disperse throughout the land. Well, they didn't do that, so God had to make them do it.
Well, there was when they building the tower, was so much confusion, that's why all the languages took place, right?
Yeah, he struck them with different languages.
Yeah, yeah,
So that they couldn't understand each other.
yeah, confusion.
Yep. And so that's when they started moving away and, moving out of whatever area they were, down in Babylon. I mean, we don't really know exactly where it was at.
But there was two lines that was really, well, one line was really evil against the Jews.
I don't know. Because, I mean, throughout history, I mean, there's been a lot of people that's been tough against the Jews. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the whole world's been against the Jews.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. But,
And they will till the Lord comes back.
yep, that's right. Yeah.
When this Rick Brenner was explaining how cruel crucifixion was, and he said to even get a bread with your feet nailed to the cross, you had to heave up.
Yeah.
And it also said that his bones his vertebrae and all were exposed where they had scourged them.
Probably, yeah.
And and I heard it said one time, I don't know if it got out of the Bible or not, that if you was the only person in the world, he would have done that for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there's no way. I love see people put these movies out. At least if they're trying to tell a story or the event, as you put it. But there's no way they can really bring the whole thing out. But
No, there's nothing like reading God's Word, and
yeah.
I mean, as much as I love the Passion of the Christ, and I really think, biblically speaking, I really think they did a really accurate job. A lot of times, whenever there's a Hollywood production, they don't do a good job with the facts and how they play things out. But with the Passion of the Christ, I think they did a really good job. They put a lot of research into it, trying to get it accurate. But you still, as even watching that, as horrific as it is, it still doesn't do justice to what he actually went through. So, I mean, it's just, for him, knowing that he went through that for me.
Realizing all that, and he evidently looked like a piece of meat.
Yeah.
When they took him off the cross, it'd be easy to understand why.
Well, the Bible tells us that he was unrecognizable.
Yeah, it'd be understandable. You can understand why even some of his followers never thought he'd come out of that grave, because they just. But he did. So.
And we're thankful that he did.
Amen.
Yeah. Well, if there's no other comment.
Will you point out where Cairo is? It's the bottom?
It's off the map, isn't it?
Let's see, where is Cairo?
Yeah, Egypt.
Yeah, I know Egypt's right here. I can't remember exactly where Cairo is in regards to this.
It's right on the Nile.
But I can't remember exactly where it is on the Nile, because that's the Nile River right there.
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly. I want to say it's closer up this way, I think. I don't think it's down here. I think it's closer up here maybe, but I might be wrong there.
I think it's further, maybe further on down, because
It could be.
I remember seeing the Nile, we was driving, beside the Nile, the Red Sea.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I'm not 100% sure, you know, exactly where Cairo is on there.
It's a big place.
Yeah. Well, the world's a big place.
Big, yeah, the world.
All right, well, if there's nothing else, Ronnie, you want to close us out in prayer?